communities have been deprived of their land. Community land has been taken without adequate compensation. They have lost their source of livelihoods. They have impacted on their religious values, that is to do with the sacred and natural sites. And in addition to that, there is encroachment and violation of environmental rights. This has to do with deforestation in those areas, water pollution. That area is basically surrounded by water bodies and a national park. So oil extractives are being, oil activities are being conducted in a national park, which is highly prohibited under the law, but also impacting on community rights. The companies in these areas have grabbed community land as well without compensating them adequately, and yet the law provides that before any land acquisition happens, the government or the company should first compensate communities prior to taking of the land. But what is happening is very different. Communities are being deprived of their land. They are being displaced. They are ending up in camps. Most of them are now in camps with the very bad conditions that exist in camps and landing sites. They have lost their source of livelihoods. One of the challenges that we have has to do with poor governance, corruption, and political influence in everything that happens, especially in these multinational companies and the businesses that they conduct. When government sees something that is hindering them from proceeding in any way, they try to go back to change the law. And they're also they've now changed the law on mining to permit mining in ecologically sensitive areas, which was also initially prohibited. So these are some of the issues that we are really up against, and we are saying that our national laws have not been effective enough, and this is because of the political influence in different arms of the government. And we are coming up to request to negotiate for a UN binding treaty that is going to hold multinational companies accountable and transparent in their activities, because community rights are being violated in the South. There is a lot of impunity that is happening with oil palm companies, but also the oil and gas sector, relating from pollution of water bodies to food insecurity, to loss of livelihoods, to poor working conditions for even laborers on these plantations, but also in the oil and gas sectors. Most of the jobs are not offered to the community people, and yet the projects are supposed to benefit the people from that specific community. The good jobs are given to expatriates who come from foreign countries because they're the ones with the skill and the expertise. So the other jobs, which are like casual work related, are given to the communities within those areas, and they don't earn well from it. So, and yet the projects, the way they are designed, are supposed to first of all benefit the communities within that specific area. So that is also another whole issue. Then, in addition to that, deforestation is at a high rate in both of these areas. And for the oil palm sector, it has so far cleared 3,600 hectares of forest in the Kalangala region where oil palm has been planted. And we all know how impactful forests are, especially in this era of climate change. But this is being done irrespective and in disregard of the issues that relate to communities and also the environment. So the issues are really many, and they touch on communities, they touch on the environment, and they also touch on climate change issues. So we come to negotiate for a UN binding treaty so that it can be able to hold these multinational companies very much accountable.
Yung una,
there's just 2 points that I would like to say to you.
mahigit isang taon na po hindi ako nakauwi sa pamilya ko.
The first one is it's been more than a year since I haven't been home to my family.
Pero naalala ko ay 3 beses lang, no. Yun, pag pumunta ako ng area po namin, never na ako makakandak ng meeting, yung regular meeting para sa customary law.
I've seen them 3 times in a year. But whenever I go to the community, there were occasions that I've been to the community.
Hirap magpasok at paglabas kasi may nagsa-surveillance.
It's very hard for me to come in and get out because there's surveillance.
Dahil natag po ako sa isang Facebook account.
because I was tagged by...
Na ako po ay isang kumontra sa estado ng gobyerno.
I was tagged in a Facebook post that I am a rebel against the government.
At yung pangalawa po, dito nag-umpisa sa kumpanya na to, yung walang magandang relasyon na sa kagubatan, yung mga sagradong lugar. So halos wala na po. Wala na kaming magandang relasyon. At yung na-divide yung tribo.
Second is the effect of this corporate encroachment is that it affected our relationship with nature, to the forest. It drastically changed our way of life, and also it changed our relationship within the tribe.
Yun, last is yung nasa sanctuary ako na kailangan ko, bakit kailangan ko sana magtago at bakit ako i-post na ako ay kontra ng gobyerno kahit minsan di ako nagiging rebelde. Salamat.
And lastly, I would like to say that now I am under sanctuary. Sanctuary is being provided for me, and I ask the question, why? Why am I being tagged as a rebel? I am not against the government. So this struggle is just one example of how indigenous peoples are treated in the Philippines. The priority really is the push for business. How their ancestral domain, the permit encroaching upon their ancestral domain was renewed was through the push of the corporation and the complicity of government. We have laws, and they're really good laws. It's really the implementation of those laws that this is a problem. Under the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, you need the free, prior, and informed consent of the indigenous peoples, affected indigenous peoples, before permits can issue, even for renewals, right? So when the company wanted to sought renewal for the permit, they asked the tribe for their consent. They said no, the end of 2016, but it was merged. The permit was merged with another permit adjacent to it, and that merger effectively renewed the permit because it was merged to another permit that was set to expire in 2032. So it was extended without their consent, and the government is saying we don't need free, prior, and informed consent. So actually, our organization will file a petition with the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources that manages these permits. We've written letters, more than 3 letters to them, asking for the cancellation, but they still haven't canceled. We have really good grounds to cancel the permit. The National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, the NCIP, which is the agency that's tasked to safeguard their rights, came out with a resolution saying that there is no FPIC, there is no FPIC, and so we will raise that resolution with the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources, and hopefully they will listen. But right now, they're not listening. So, as you can see, the government is in on this. They are partners of the corporation. Same thing in the Philippines. There is such a thing as the Investment Defense Force, where military is used by corporations as security guards. It's a real thing. A specific deployment by the military, they're public officers, but they're compensated by the company to guard industry. And that is a terrible policy because it's clear conflict of interest. The military will always side with the company. And so this has produced harassments and killings in their case. And I'm going to switch now to other industries such as mining. The Philippines is ranked number 1 in Asia in 2017 by Global Witness. for killings of environmental human rights defenders. It's a very unsafe place for EHRDs. Whenever there's mining, there is killing. Because the first wave of violations is the taking of land, violations of economic, social, and cultural rights. When the community opposes the project, they are violated. Their rights are violated. Their civil and political rights are violated. They're killed or red tagged or thrown in jail. So that's always the trend. And I echo the sentiment of my colleagues here that our domestic systems are weak because they are partners of the corporations. One additional thing. Most corporations in the Philippines are domestic corporations because we have constitutional limitations for corporation. Before you can operate as a corporation in the Philippines, you have to be Philippine-owned. But that doesn't stop investors, foreign investors, from coming in, partnering with domestic corporations. So that's also something that should be addressed by the treaty. The Philippines is slowly turning into an authoritarian regime. Civic space is shrinking and shrinking. Opposition is discouraged. We have measures from the government. For example, this has never been done before. Non-profit organizations are now required to disclose where their funding is coming from. EU money cannot reach organizations before our foreign ministry gives clearance. And I don't know if you've heard about our president. He has lashed out against the EU, has said so many things against human rights defenders, human rights activists, and in their area, in Mindanao, the president declared martial law, and it's still under martial law until now. So that is the context. That is the context we are dealing with.
This is very important for us to see, because this is how Europe is linked to the different abuses or environmental declarations that are taking place in the southern countries. So most of these different companies are supported or now financed by banking institutions and financial institutions from Europe. That is very important for you to note. So, for example, in Liberia, we have the big Indonesian company is called Golden Viridian Liberia, which is a subsidiary of Golden Agro Resources. But Golden Viridian Liberia is then being financed by Rabobank from the Netherlands and financial institutions from the Netherlands. The Maryland oil palm plantation, for example, is being financed by FMO. It's financing that through CIFCA. So CIFCA is also involved in West Africa, and CIFCA is a big institution doing this kind of work in West Africa. But more to that is maybe the connection that my colleague was talking about working through national institutions, national companies. That's the strategy. And so the international companies, the transnational corporations say, oh no, it's not us that is doing this, it's a different institution. So, for example, Golden Viridian Liberia is considered to be a Liberian or company operating in Liberia as an independent company. Even though they've been financed by Golden Agro Resources, they've been supported by Golden Agro, in fact, even including recruitment of senior executive of the company. But when the company has been accused of doing wrong and linking that to Golden Agro Resources, they say, oh, no, that's not us. I mean, that company is an independent company. But if you check the records, they are the one that is running the show. They are the one that's financing these institutions, and they are sitting at the back. So that is that strategy they are now using, because and that's one of the reasons why we from the different countries are particularly saying that if the text, for example, of the UN banning treaty is to be developed, it should not just be transnational corporations. It should be national corporations as well. In that way, you tighten the boats, because that's the strategy they are using. In the oil palm companies, they have in different regulations and standards. So, for example, under the RSPO principles and criteria, they are not supposed to clear primary forests. They consider them high carbon stock or high carbon value forest areas. The oil palm companies are not supposed. Well, in a way to clean themselves, they will pass through national locking corporations, for example. So they work through locking institutions, locking companies, and say, and that will go to the community and say, "Oh, hang on, we are not here to take your land. We are just interested in the logs, and we want to take logs." So they sign an agreement with the communities, without the community knowing the implications, the plan that is behind. So then they savage the forest areas. So by the logging activity, they savage the forest areas, and then when that is done, then the oil palm companies come 4-5 years down the road and say, "We need the area." But then the areas, the forest has lost its value. And that is particularly worrying because in Liberia has at least 40% of the remaining Guinean rainforests. So that makes Liberia a very forested area. And in the areas where the oil palm companies have been giving land to expand their oil palm plantation, that's where the Sapo National Park, which is one of the biggest parks in the region, is situated. And it's a heavily and forested area. And so the companies are using that strategy, working with logging companies, go and salvage the forest area, and then they come after. So a range of different strategy they are using. So for and that is why it is important for international institutions, people with interest in the kind of work that is happening in the Southern countries, to work with us. I was talking to a group recently on the scene tour, and the guy came out, "How can we help you?" And we're saying the connections between these companies is very important. The financial institutions that are financing this kind of work, and it's very important. So, yeah, that's some of the strategy they are using. It's good for people to take note of that.
We also hope that the treaty would cover international financial institutions. For example, one mining corporation in the Philippines that has just wrecked the seas of an island in Luzon near the Visayas region, which just destroyed the waters there. It's the Mar Copper Corporation. They were financed in the 90s by Asian Development Bank. And so something has to be said there as well. Apart from the foreign investment from, I believe, a Canadian corporation. And apart from that, the treaty should also cover the entire supply chain, I believe. For example, with the Dandes case, it's very hard to monitor where the coffee goes to. We don't know where the coffee goes to. But that's part of the business. The source, who is buying the coffee, that's an entire chain. And, well, as worded right now, the treaty doesn't actually define transnational corporations. It says businesses of transnational character. So I think we can elaborate on that more and to include the entire supply chain, because it's also a preventive measure for corporations, for people affected by corporations, so that they will be mindful and exercise due diligence when they buy their supply.
True, we have the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. We have other principles like the OECD principles. We have the Roundtable Sustainable Palm Oil, on palm oil. All these are not binding. They are voluntary mechanisms that are in place. And as we were going on in our tour, whenever we're talking about these principles and guidelines, we kept saying that they are for good people, of which the companies do not fit to be. So any company would just look at those principles and guidelines and ignore them because they don't tie them in any way. And even if they committed any injustice, they're not held accountable by the guidelines. So they are just persuasive in nature and not binding. And so that's why we are saying that even when we have these ones in place, even when we have the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, the OECD principles, and other guiding mechanisms in place, we still need a binding treaty which is going to hold multinational companies accountable and transparent, but also to ensure that they conduct due diligence in their daily activities. And in that way, we feel that we think that companies will try to adjust on their practices on ground, because at the end of the day, if you and I know that there is a law that you're supposed to adhere to, and if you fail to adhere to it, there is maybe a sanction or a penalty. There is a way of force to work towards that. Then in addition to that, we've said that our domestic laws, our national laws, are not being adhered to. I've given an example where laws are being changed in a month, in weeks, because they are not suiting the interests of the government and the companies. So having this international treaty will be of a more advantage, because no government is going to wake up and amend it in a month because it is saying something different from what they expected to get from it. So in a way, being an international treaty, it is going to hold governments accountable and also the companies accountable. And there won't be issues of changing it easily.
It's very interesting because currently I think it's mostly countries in the global south who are pushing for this UN treaty, while all the countries in the global north are not so much in favor of it. Like the EU and the USA, Canada, Singapore is not for it either, whereas it's like, your country is pushing for this to happen. It's a very interesting power balance, I think, which is worth taking a thought on. Can you go more into depth with what you do then in your work, in your NGOs? Like, how do you work with communities and how do you enlighten people about their rights and stuff? Can you push for legal change within your countries as well?
And my colleague Joanne talk about countries having very good laws. The challenge in our countries, particularly in the global south, and in my case in Liberia, is and compliance and people properly implementing these laws, and that is simply not happening simply because the companies are so powerful that it still is vulnerable to kind of engage with them. In our work, what we do, and directly to your question, is helping communities. So we turn all the legal instruments into simple Liberian English and take them to the communities. We use our existing laws and say, these are your rights that are under the laws that you have, and these are the privileges you are supposed to enjoy, and this is the kind of support that we can give you that other people, legal-minded people, lawyers, environmentalists, other organizations can help you to go through. And so we do that every time, interpreting and building capacity with them, using different apps. So right now we are using one app called Timbi. Timbi is an online app. They can get it on Android's phone, so they can document violation. So where the company is clearing a primary forest, a community member can actually take a photo or do a video and send that online, and then it will come to our database, and we can have that information. So we're doing a range of different things. Other things we're doing is documenting community perspective and presenting them at national level debates and say, this is the thinking, bringing them themselves. That is the same way we are here today. Some of the stories we're sharing here, if people who are based in Europe and environmentalists are sharing these stories, somebody will say, these are the same stories we've been hearing over the years. But at least you're hearing it from people from the ground. I may say something a little bit different. So we bring communities from the ground to national level debates to present their issues. Yeah.
The UN Treaty can help tremendously, I think, if we do sign and ratify the treaty. In the Philippines, there are the treaty itself actually covers a whole gamut of international human rights treaties. It is listed in the treaty text itself, all the relevant human rights treaties, and it includes indigenous people's rights. And the Philippines has one law. It's called the Indigenous People's Rights Act. I mentioned this earlier. And it's actually a pretty good law. It's not perfect, but it safeguards a bundle of rights, including rights to ancestral domain, customary law, and it's the right to self-determination, and it constitutes, creates this National Commission on Indigenous Peoples that is very powerful on paper. Very powerful on paper. the IPRA requires, again, and this is in Section 59 of the law, that whenever there are government concessions, a certificate coming from the National Commission of Indigenous Peoples, NCIP, should be procured by a corporation before they can operate. The certificate is the approval of the community, approval saying that they have consented, they have given their free, prior, and informed consent. That is a powerful certificate, but it's given away, like it's a meaningless piece of paper. It's so easy, and like the consent process is supposedly a very substantive, and there are rules. There are rules provided by the NCIP itself, but it's mostly expedited and not followed. And to tell you a little bit of the IPRA, it was actually when it was enacted, it was contested by former justices of the Supreme Court. Actually, I don't know if they were working for business. Maybe they were. And it was decided on the constitutionality of the law. The Supreme Court decided. We have 15 justices. I don't know why the other justice did not vote, but that case, which is this thick, it's like one scra. We call it our cases are in Supreme Court's court reports annotated. It's super thick. It was decided 7-7. 7 in favor of constitutionality, 7 against. So even the government was undecided. That is why it is in effect right now, because of a technicality. They could not rule on the constitutionality. But awesome for indigenous rights activists and indigenous peoples that it's effective, because it was close to becoming unconstitutional. So that's the law that we have, and we have the NCIP, and of course we also have judicial mechanisms. We have the writ of kalikasan. Kalikasan means nature. Writ of nature, writ of continuing mandamus, where the court orders an agency like the Ministry of Environment to do its job, to cancel the permit. That's what we're gonna file, the writ of continuing mandamus. So we have these mechanisms, but like what my colleagues have been saying, they're very weak because of the implementation, because the companies are very powerful in our nations.
So I think, that's one of the reasons why we're saying that in the text, it should not just be transnational corporations, it should be national corporations as well. So because in that way, you tighten the board. So even if the companies are using the title to say, not us, it's the national corporations, the national corporations are held accountable. And if they are held accountable, they will show to us who they're making business with, who they're linked with. And that is going to. So that is a way to deal with the situation. Otherwise, if we tie the whole banning treaty on transnational corporations, almost all the transnational corporations will go to national corporations. If we kind of keep the content or the text of the banning treaty only on transnational corporations, yes, fair enough. The transnational corporation can remain in Europe, can remain in Asia, can remain in America, and support local groups on the ground, and that would be the same business as usual. So I think just starting every one of them would be useful.
These multinationals, some, when they come on ground, they form subsidiaries. So they form subsidiary companies at the national level, and so you find the subsidiary company is nationally based. It is a company from there. So which makes them, in a way, escape some form of liability, because when they form those subsidiaries, they make the subsidiary get in charge of maybe processing, while one is for like the plantations. So you find their roles and duties are differing in a way, but the shareholders are the same, and they're all under one mother company. So you still find that they all crop from one transnational company that is behind all these injustices. And when you go to the mother company, they will tell you, no, for us, we are on the processing part. Please go and pursue maybe Oil Palm Uganda Limited. It's them that is doing the plantations. When you go to Oil Palm to Opal, they'll tell you, for us, we are at a contract level. Please go to this other company. So they will turn you up back and forth because of forming those subsidiary companies. And so we think that the treaty should not just focus on the transnational companies alone, but also the nationally based companies, because you find most of those national based companies, they have some state or government hand in them. Most of them are government-owned companies that have been formed by the rich within government, and they're using those companies to get profit through the businesses that they are conducting. And in the process, they are violating human rights. So if it can also cater for the national companies, it would be a very good advantage in addition to tackling transnational companies.
The treaty should cover the entire business, the entire supply chain, and treat these transnational corporations or businesses with, I think it's better to phrase it as businesses with transnational character, because it's very easy for companies to strategize and in segments the business, right? But these businesses cannot operate without each other. Cannot produce the same products, cannot deliver the same goods without each other. And so the treaty should treat them as one. And then we can discuss the level of liability in the negotiations. Something I forget to mention, state-owned companies should also be included in the treaty. For example, in the Philippines, the current administration is pushing for this build program, like building infrastructure. It's going to be the golden age of infrastructure. There will be a dam that will be constructed soon, and will be affecting a mountain range, the Sierra Madre mountain range in the Philippines, and it will displace indigenous communities, and it will be built by a Chinese company, and the loan is with China, and so that will be a trend in the years to come. I think it's not just happening in the Philippines; it's happening everywhere, with China and its Belt Road initiative. So, yeah, national corporations should be included in the treaty.
The space for civil society organizations is shrinking, and even us who are doing this work, at times we feel the risk, we feel a bit scared and threatened by companies, but also by the government because of what is happening on ground. And so if we as civil society groups, we can feel this way, how about those communities that are not empowered, that are very, very vulnerable? They need some protection at the international level as well, because a community member will come and issue and file a complaint, but going back to their community, like this one we've seen, who has not gone back to his home for almost a year, that is something that is possible in any South country, because the companies don't like any person who comes out to speak against them. So we would think that if the treaty would put in place some protection of human rights defenders, but also complainants who bring issues that relate to the abuses that are being conducted by multinational companies and the environmental issues, it would be of an added advantage, because otherwise the communities will not come out to bring these complaints. They will feel threatened, they will feel scared and intimidated by the companies. My friend keeps talking about how big these companies are in terms of power. They have the money, they have the capacity to do anything. And surprisingly, they even tell this to the communities. At times when the communities are trying to fight for their land and they are pursuing maybe court systems, they are always reminded how they are battling very powerful companies. There is nothing that they can achieve out of it. They are going to lose. So those are all threats that are issued by multinational companies to communities. And so if we are able to get justice, we should get it in a way that is very protective to the community members who would be bringing the complaints as well.
Dande is being secured and sanctuaried by the EU from an EU fund. These are welcome funds. These are welcome protections from the EU. But it's not holistic. It is addressing the effects of the root causes. The root cause is the business. The root causes are violations of corporations, big corporations. And I'm afraid if this is the approach of the EU, it's just a vicious cycle. So if the EU is serious, and I implore you, because you are in a position of privilege and power, to convince your governments to have a more holistic approach, because it's not enough. Thank you, but it's not enough.
So you and I, we both have a role to play. We are playing our role by coming to lobby, but after we've left, we would also want you to do what you can to protect human rights defenders in any way that is possible, because like we mentioned, our civic space in our different countries is shrinking. And what does this relate to? It relates to freezing of bank accounts of organizations. It relates to closure of offices, and not only small civil society organizations, even big ones. And like we've said, there is a linkage between the government and the companies. The threats and the risks are still the same. We need protection of us as human rights defenders on our home countries to see how we can be more secure in whatever we are doing. If it relates to supporting security trainings, it is some support that would be appreciated. If it relates to securing our data and information, it is also something that can be done by you in supporting us in that aspect, because, like we said, we do this lobby and advocacy based on facts and figures and data. So the risk is really big on civil society organizations. And what is even more annoying is that the laws are being implemented discriminatory according to what they are targeting. That's how they implement the laws. So we would really seek for support both at the national level but also at the international level in seeing how this treaty can be passed, but also in protecting us back in our home countries.